Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, and the podcast is Life Along the Merrimack. We meet once a week for about a half hour, and we talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. And of course, we discuss Plum Island from time to time. That's a big part of the river complex. With me today is John Macone, who is with the Merrimack River Watershed Council. And John, thank you very much for being here and talking about the river with us.
Thank you so much, Dyke. I appreciate it.
Now, maybe just for starters, you can talk a little about your organization. What is the Watershed Council, and what are the goals of this organization?
Sure. Okay. So the Merrimack River Watershed Council, it's quite a mouthful, was formed about 45 years ago, back when the river was really filthy, and there were bad. It was hard to imagine. There were almost no sewer plants on it, so all the sewage was going into it. All kinds of industrial waste going into it, and the Clean Water Act had just recently passed, but hadn't really done anything to clean up the river. So the purpose of the Watershed Council was to have a nonprofit that could kind of cross state barriers and work with different federal agencies and state agencies and communities and unite them in common causes. Sometimes when government is trying to do something, it's somewhat hobbled by whatever silo it's in. And so that was the idea. And we still do that today. And so they were very successful in getting a lot of groups to work together and to get things done. And so it's a model that we still use today. We have members throughout the Merrimack River watershed. So that's extends all the way up into, well, basically where the old man in the mountain was, up into Franconia Notch, and then south through Massachusetts. And we have members of our board from throughout that region too. And we have openings on the board. I mean, the board is a group that likes to be involved with the Merrimack, and they want to make decisions that will, policy decisions that will be helpful.
Well, the river is 117 miles long, as I understand it, and starts in Franklin, New Hampshire. So I imagine, a lot of your activity involves New Hampshire. Now, granted, they have in some parts a much more rural area than we do. When we think of part of the river, we think of Lowell and Lawrence and Haverhill. Of course, up there you have Manchester and Concord, but nevertheless, you have quite a bit of activity up in New Hampshire.
Yeah, that's true. And one of the reasons for that is a few years ago, the Merrimack was declared one of the most endangered rivers in the United States by the U.S. Forestry Service. And their rationale for that was that so much of the watershed in New Hampshire is undeveloped, but it could be developed. And if it is, then the river will be greatly diminished in terms of pollution that gets into it, and runoff and all these things we don't want to have happen. And so what we're trying to do now is we're trying to act on that and work with other partner groups in New Hampshire and figure out ways to protect what they call landscape sized parcels along the Merrimack and well into the interior beyond it to protect the river. So forests are the best protection we can have for a river. It's really the most cost effective and the most effective way to keep it clean. So we want to try to keep as much land as possible undeveloped within the watershed and near these streams and lakes and ponds that feed into it.
Well, we're coming up on 2 centuries actually of having factories and mills on the river. I think in about 1822, the first mill went up in Lowell, and 20 years later, another went up in Lawrence. So over the years, mills have provided a lot of jobs on the North Shore. And I say that with earnestness because there were many people from Europe who came over, Irish during the potato famine, many people, Jews and Italians, Armenians, whatever, from persecutions in Europe. So in my view, the mills did pretty good at one time, but you're concerned about the mills now, and you're concerned about the pollution that still comes from some of the mills upriver. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, most of that has been cleaned up, but there are still some sources of pollution. For example, there was just a lawsuit filed by Conservation Law Foundation of two sites on the Merrimack where there's a metal recycling company that allegedly is dumping lots of waste into the river. So they'd like to see that stopped. Another source of pollution we have that's pretty well known in New Hampshire, less so in Mass, is there's a plant called the St. Cobain plant in Merrimack, New Hampshire, right near the Merrimack River. And they produce chemicals, and some of the what comes out of their smoke pipes is PFAS laden materials. The PFAS is called a forever chemical. It can be very dangerous. It can be a carcinogenic material for humans. So there's a plume in that area of private wells that have been shut down, and also this is starting to get into the Merrimack River as well. So that's sort of a new industrial contaminant that we're just really learning more about, and New Hampshire's doing a really good job of trying to mitigate it, but it's there, and it's hard to get it out of the river.
One of the remarkable things that I learned when I started doing research on this, I wrote a book called Merrimack, the Resilient River, is how many people still get their drinking water from the Merrimack. Now, Can you talk about that a little bit? I know that the water is, of course, is purified, it has chemicals, and it has modern ways of cleansing it, but we still get a lot of drinking water. How many folks get drinking water from the Merrimack, would you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's a great book, by the way. I hope your listeners have picked it up. So there's around 600,000 people.
Wow, now that is a large number. I've got to say, I'm still surprised at that. I'm sorry, continue.
It is a very large number. There's only one other source of water that's a surface source of water, public water, that's larger, and that's the Quabbin, which is a pristine waterway. And of course, we know, the Merrimack has sewage dumped into it. It has chemicals in it, runoff from all these industrial cities along it. So the EPA, we've been told, considers it to be the dirtiest source of water in New England. It does get cleaned up. People should know that when they drink out of their taps, that water has been processed, and it passes all the tests that is necessary. So you're not going to get contaminants from your drinking water. But the problem is the source of the water has a lot of contaminants in it.
And one thing that I understand, when we have storms, rainstorms and snow runoff, and it's more frequent nowadays because I understand we get harsher, quicker rainstorms. A lot of the rainwater goes into the sewage treatment plants. Can you talk about that? Was that the way it was created, or, is it just getting to be a very large problem?
Yeah, they were designed for that to happen, for them to release the excess into the river. You got to think back 50 years ago, there were no plants at all. And so the idea was to at least have plants that could handle the day-to-day sewage that was coming in. It was just not deemed feasible to build them to the capacity of what might enter the plant during a rainstorm, because in a lot of these old cities, the street drains are connected directly into the sewer lines, because those sewer lines used to dump into the river. So everything would go into the river. But now when it rains, you get all that water from rainstorms that come in, and that's what we call a combined sewage overflow, or CSO. And it overwhelms the plants. So this is not a problem of the sewage plants making per se. They were following the rules of the time when they were created, but the rules have changed over years, and we're setting higher and higher standards, hopefully to the point where these CSOs end. There is a cap point for all of these plants where they have to stop dumping sewage into the river. It's decades from now, but there is an end point.
Mhm. As I understand it, the challenges that you outlined are from upriver. Newburyport, Amesbury, Salisbury, they are not part of the communities that are overwhelmed and the sewage goes in with the rainwater. As
Right.
I understand it, it's Lowell, Lawrence, Haverhill, and the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, knows about this and they're kind of on their case. But as
Oh,
you
yeah.
pointed out, you can't do it overnight. But on that point, there's a lot of talk about infrastructure improvements, and that could be roads and bridges, but there's also some discussion of more federal aid for sewage treatment plants. Have you heard anything about that, say, in the last year or so? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
nothing's final from what I understand, but is there a chance that the plants will be improved by some of this federal money?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So what's happened is, these plants in their initial thinking, going back several years, is they wanted to get these projects done, but they had to do it with whatever money was available within their communities. And that's pretty limited. All of a sudden, the sluice gates have opened because we passed, the infrastructure bill and another bill called the ARPA bill passed last year. That's just pumping literally billions of dollars into Massachusetts all at once. And this money needs to be spent. So now these plants have got to be scrambling and thinking, here's an opportunity for us to take advantage of all this money. So it's kind of caught a lot of people by surprise that there's, on the one hand, it's great. You've got this good opportunity, but on the other hand, we may not have really been ready for it because it happened so quickly.
Well, as I say, it's possible that, the EPA can link up with, Lowell and Lawrence on those situations. Manchester, New Hampshire, actually, I don't know if it's the same money, but Manchester, New Hampshire last fall announced a very large initiative, about $130 million to improve their sewage treatment complex. Now that's over 20 years. But even so, Manchester was one of the key polluters with these CSOs. And it seems like they've taken a step in the right direction.
Yeah, they have. And they were, as all these plants are there, they enter into agreements with the EPA. So that was part of their agreement to end CSOs. And they did it before any of this money became available. So now they're able to claw back money to make it more affordable and perhaps to quicken the pace of what they're doing. But one of the things to keep in mind here is that this money comes from the federal government and it goes into our state houses, Mass and New Hampshire, and then legislators decide how it's going to be spent. So they've got this big pool of money. None of it is specifically aimed towards the Merrimack River or to our plants. So this is where it's really important for people to contact their legislators and say, we really want you to solve this problem, because it makes a big difference when people hear when legislators hear from people, because this is kind of a little bit of a Wild West right now. We're going to enter this period where so much money is available. Everybody wants a piece of it, but for our area, this is a once in a lifetime deal that we really want to see these plants improved, and they need our help.
When we talk about the river and governmental action, one of the initiatives held towards the east end of the river, Newburyport, Salisbury, etc., is the dredging of the Merrimack River. And that's been, first of all, it's been done in the past, we know that. And there's been talk of it in the last decade or so. And, is that moving forward, John? Do you get the sense that there's money there, or there's an action item perhaps to get some dredging done?
Yeah, it sounds like that's going to happen. So there was a meeting on Friday of interested groups under the auspice of this kind of an ad hoc group called the Merrimack River Beach Alliance. And it was announced that the Army Corps got almost $3 million to put towards this project. And that's a big boost because they were going to do it this year, but the bids they got came in so high that they couldn't do it. So they put it off till next year. And they're also thinking about changing the project a little bit so it's a little more affordable. So what they'd like to do is move about 250,000 cubic yards of sand, which is, I don't know how many Gillette stadiums that would fill. It's one of those kind of numbers. It's astronomical. And pump that sand in front of the area called Reservation Terrace, at the northern end of Plum Island to try to stave off some of the erosion that's happening there.
Now, Reservation Terrace is at the far north of the island. Part of it is dunes, of course. The city owns a parking lot there, but that is the area in the last year or two that listeners may know has really been under duress from erosion, from storms. And so did you hear about, we had a snowstorm, of course, over the weekend. Did you hear if any of the homes down there were damaged or were under duress at that point?
I heard that there was overflow of water, but there wasn't anything like we had 2 weeks ago, where one of the houses was condemned and there were, I forget how many more had water around them. So it wasn't as bad of a storm as people thought perhaps it would be. Also, they had taken some action, the city and some of the neighbors, to build up some of the barriers in that area to prevent the wave action from really slamming into houses and doing a lot of damage.
If they do the dredging this summer, of course, we've been talking about helping the beach and staving off erosion, but it might improve the navigation. Now, you have a vessel, and as I understand, there's sandbars, there's moving sand. Is the opening of the Merrimack a challenging harbor to get in and out of?
Oh yeah, I have a small boat, so it's always challenging for me. But yeah, it's true. There's this natural phenomenon that happens on either side of the mouth of the river, and it's caused by the tide and by the flow of the river. And so you get this thing called they call it the bar, and it's just at the end of the jetties, and it's this area where the sand mounds up. So it gets very shallow there at low tide, and it's very dangerous because it's so shallow and there's so much water moving over it that you can have all kinds of crazy wave actions that can, occasionally you see in the news a large boat will get flipped over there. So yeah, it's helpful when they dredge it because it kind of blows a hole through this bar, but it rebuilds. It's just the natural.
It has for years, as I understand. If you read some of the old ledgers of 18th, 19th century, coming in, and I guess the tide is a big factor as well, because if you have the tide of the Merrimack going east and you have the turning of perhaps an incoming tide going the other way, it must be a real challenge for newcomers, from wherever, who get here, and all of a sudden they're in a maelstrom of water, depending on the tide, I would think.
Yeah, it's like the most terrifying amusement park ride you've ever been on. And of course, the end could be that you get dumped over into the roiling water. So yeah, it's scary. But this is common to sandy mouthed rivers all around the world, these sandbars that form, and you have to maintain them every few years if you want to allow free passage through them. And I think the last time this was dredged, you can't quote me on this, I guess, but 10 or 15 years ago, something like that. So typically they want to see it done about every 3 years. So it's a little overdue.
Yeah, people do talk about it, and I know a number of folks at Reservation Terrace who have homes there are hoping for a dredging if some of that sand can be put back up on the beach. And I would mention that numerous houses have been built out on Reservation Terrace in recent years. But I spoke to an engineer and he said, you know what, when they made their plans, the erosion was not so manifest. And the houses were hundreds of feet from the river. But I guess the river's been changing, John, and it's getting closer to those houses. And when you have a high tide and a strong wind, they are under duress.
Yeah, that's true. And, I feel like it's a little bit of a whack-a-mole problem out there where, we've created these man-made structures. For example, the jetties are a big deal. They were meant to, they're shaped and meant to be a funnel that would force water through the bar and blow it apart. That was the idea of it, that they would, we wouldn't have to dredge anymore because the jetties would hold the mouth of the river in place and also blow a hole through. Well, they don't work that way. But one thing we know they do is they impact the way sand flows back and forth along the ocean coast and also within the river. And so when they were repaired, what was it, 8 years ago, they changed the dynamics of the way water flows through there and how sand flows. And that's when all this erosion began in that section. But, ironically, there was a public furor to rebuild them leading up to them being rebuilt because there was so much erosion happening farther down Plum Island.
As I understand it, some of those places farther down the island have now got more sand.
Yeah,
it helped them.
Right. So yeah, you're kind of like robbing Peter to pay Paul all the time on Plum Island. No matter what you do, there's only, somebody is going to pay a price for it, it seems. And that's what we're seeing now. The same thing happened in the 1970s when they rebuilt the jetties. Exact same place, same problem. And, it led to some really severe erosion, and they would dump sand there and it would wash away. And if you go out there today, you'll find these big concrete blocks that are buried. Some of them are buried in the sand. Those were put in the 1970s to protect that area from all the erosion that was going on. So, it's.
Well, several years ago, pursuant to your point about the erosion, down towards the center and down towards the Newberry end, almost to the area where the Parker River Wildlife Refuge begins, they were losing not just sand, but several houses fell over the cliff, if you will, fell over the dune, and they were destroyed. A dozen more were condemned. But since that time, they've been accreting more sand, and they're doing better. But I also had mentioned, John, and I think you've seen this, some of the homeowners there have brought in tons of boulders, and they put the boulders between the house and high tide mark. And for the moment, that seems to be helping them. And I've talked to a couple people, and they say, this is our money, this was not government money, but I wouldn't have a house here if these boulders weren't holding back what we have. So I don't think the state ever approved that, but it seems to be working for the moment.
Yeah, it does. And yeah, there's a lot of controversy about that, about whether that ultimately was the right idea. But I understand where those folks are coming from. They're their homes and they want to protect them. But we're kind of forcing the sand to do new things by doing that. And it's hard to predict somebody is going to pay a price for that somewhere along.
Well, in recent years, as you said, that the river's gotten cleaner and boaters have really come back to the Merrimack. There 1,500 boats are registered with the Newburyport Harbor Master and more in Amesbury and Salisbury. So, because of what you said, cleaner water, this area has become a summer mecca all over again because of this cleaner water and better conditions.
Yeah, it's amazing. And you keep going up the river too. There are public beaches, even in Lowell, there's a public bathing beach on the Merrimack. It's clean enough there so that people can swim there most of the summer. So it's really an incredible turnabout, and that is the future of the river, I suppose, is it's going to be a recreational river and a water supply. Whereas, in the past, it was it was like our highway, like a 495 or something before the highways existed. And then it became this, it powered the industries with the dams and the canals. So it keeps evolving.
Well, we just have a minute more, John. This is Life Along the Merrimack. It's a podcast on 96.3 FM, local cable TV, Channel 9, and it is archived on YouTube. John is with the Watershed Council. What are a couple things you have planned for the spring and summer, John? Do you do cleanups, or do you chart the water, or save the sturgeon, or what do you have planned?
Yeah, sturgeon are a great story. We could do a whole program on them. Sturgeon are making a big comeback to the Merrimack River. Yeah, we're going to have a few programs this summer. We'll be doing cleanups. We'll be doing hikes and walking tours and some virtual events. So people want to see what we're doing, please check out merrimack.org. That's our website, or you can go to our Facebook page. We also put up our programs there.
So it seems like, there's great interest in the river, and, there could be some federal money coming here for the sewage treatment plants. If that were to happen, it might get a bit cleaner. And in terms of tours, John, you've given a tour or two. Where do you take people if you were going to give them a little tour about the river and about the watershed?
Yeah, that's the neat thing about the Merrimack is there's so many places along this river that you can walk right along the river on public land. Maudsley is one of the best of the sites to see because it's such a beautiful view from there, and the terrain is varied, and all sorts of natural, interesting things to see. The eagles, mountain.
How about behind you, John? There's a beautiful graphic behind you.
Oh yeah.
Where on the river is that graphic? Where's the photo from?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So this is a place I kind of stumbled across. It's just north of Concord, New Hampshire. It's called Muchito Banks. And this is the largest inland sand dune or maybe the only one, I think, in New Hampshire and perhaps all of New England, I believe. But if you look, you can see over my shoulder over here.
Yes,
these banks are, I think they're about 100 feet tall. They're sand banks that drop right down to the river. And those were formed at the time when this area was actually a lake before the river existed. But those sandbanks are still there, and they are just sheer drops right down to the Merrimack. It's really a beautiful spot. Well,
it's not spring yet, but anything, the river looks good. And I think talking about the river, it might be, get a little better from navigation this summer. And so there's a lot to look forward to. I've been speaking with John Macone from the Merrimack River Watershed Council. I'm Dyke Hendrickson. The podcast is Life Along the Merrimack, where we talk about the history and health of the Merrimack River. We'll be back again next week. John, thank you very much for being on the program, and I look forward to talking to you in the future.
Thank you, Dyke.
Okay, we're finished for today, and we'll be back next week. Thank you again, John.